The wind at 7,000 feet does not just blow, it strips. It finds the gaps in your zippers, the loose weave in your scarf, and the seam where your glove meets your sleeve. It is a physical weight, a constant, shoving hand that wants to push you off the steel and down into the granite teeth of the North Cascades. I tightened the lanyard on my safety harness, listening to the dual clicks of the locking carabiners engaging with the tower leg. The steel was rime-coated, a thick, white crust of frozen fog that shattered under my boots every time I shifted my weight. I was 120 feet off the ground, suspended on a lattice of galvanized iron, staring into the guts of a 6-foot microwave drum antenna. My name is Elias Thorne. For the last 15 years, I've been the guy who climbs the things other people are afraid to look at. I fixed the nervous system of the state, the microwave relays, the cellular backbones, the government repeaters that keep the troopers talking and the data flowing. It's a quiet trade. You spend your life looking down on the world, fixing invisible beams of light that carry the voices of millions of people who will never know your name. This site was designated Summit 4. It was a standard remote relay station, a concrete block shelter anchored to the bedrock, a propane tank farm, a backup diesel generator, and the tower itself. It sat on a jagged spur of rock overlooking the Highway 2 corridor, miles above the timberline. The air up here was thin and smelled of ozone and pine resin. I had the Fluke multimeter propped against the mounting bracket, the leads jammed into the test ports of the low-noise block down converter. The reading was drifting. It should have been a steady 48 volts DC, but it was jumping. Bad ground. Somewhere in the chaotic mess of cabling that ran down the tower leg, a copper bond had corroded or shaken loose in the wind. "Control, this is Thorne at Summit 4, I said, keying the mic on my chest radio. "I'm seeing voltage instability on the Alpha sector. I'm going to need to trace the run. Expect an alarm on the rectifiers." Static. Just the white noise of the atmosphere. A hiss that sounded like sand pouring on a tin roof. "Control, copy?" Nothing. I checked the squelch knob. I checked the battery level. Both were fine. I looked down at the shelter roof, a gray rectangle of corrugated steel surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. The satellite uplink dish on the roof was stationary. It should have been tracking, making those tiny robotic adjustments to stay locked on the geostationary bird to the south. It was dead still. I was not worried yet. Radios fail. Satellites drift. The mountains are giant Faraday cages that eat signals for breakfast. I assumed it was just another localized outage, another headache to add to the invoice. I did not know then that the silence was not a technical glitch. It was the sound of the world below holding its breath before the scream. I finished the alignment, locking down the azimuth bolts with a heavy crescent wrench. The torque felt good in my hand, a clean, mechanical certainty. Steel against steel. I wiped the grease from the threads, packed my tools into the canvas bucket, and began the long descent. Climbing down a tower is harder than going up. Your quads burn, and gravity tries to pull you too fast. You have to be deliberate. Hook, step, unhook. Hook, step, unhook. By the time my boots hit the gravel of the compound, my breath was pluming in the cold air. I walked to the shelter door. It was a heavy steel slab, painted industrial gray, with a keypad lock and a hydraulic closer. I punched in the code, 1985, and the solenoid clicked. Inside, the shelter was a wall of noise. The HVAC units were roaring, trying to cool the racks of equipment that generated heat 24 hours a day. Fans whirred, hard drives spun.
It was the warm, electric heartbeat of the grid. But when I looked at the main status board, the lights were wrong. Usually the panel is a Christmas tree of green LEDs. Green meant signal. Green meant flow. Today, the board was a sea of red. Backhaul, down. Grid power, fail. Generator status, running.
Remote telemetry. Lost. I dropped my tool bag on the anti-static floor mat and walked to the laptop sitting on the crash cart. I plugged into the local console port. The screen flickered to life, scrolling lines of code. The logs showed a cascade failure starting 48 hours ago. It was not just this tower. The upstream nodes, Seattle, Everett, Wenatchee, had all gone dark sequentially. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. This was not a corroded wire. This was a systemic collapse. I went to the equipment rack for the emergency spectrum analyzer. It's a device that listens to the airwaves, visualizing radio frequency energy. I hooked it up to the external antenna and turned the gain all the way up. Normally, the spectrum in Washington is a chaotic forest of spikes. FM radio, TV broadcasts, LTE bands, police dispatch, aviation channels. It's a wall of noise. The screen was flat. There were a few jagged spikes, automated emergency beacons, probably, but the voice bands were gone. The FM dial was dead. The silence I had heard on my chest radio was not a malfunction. It was absolute. I walked out of the shelter and went to the edge of the cliff. The view from Summit 4 is usually spectacular. You can see the ribbon of the highway winding through the pass, the toy-sized cars moving between the dark green of the pines. I pulled my binoculars from the tool bag. They were heavy. Rubber-armored Steiners I used for inspecting tower welds from the ground. I raised them to my eyes and focused on the highway, 5 miles away and 3,000 feet down. The road was not a ribbon of motion anymore. It was a parking lot. Thousands of cars were jammed bumper to bumper in the westbound lanes, heading toward the coast. They were not moving. Doors were open. I saw tiny, colored specks scattered on the asphalt between the vehicles. Luggage, clothes, bodies. I adjusted the focus wheel, my hands trembling slightly. Smoke was rising in thin, black columns from the tunnel entrance to the east. A semi-truck was jackknifed across the median, burning. And then I saw the movement. It was not the flow of traffic. It was a swarm. On the shoulder of the highway, a mass of dark shapes was moving upstream against the direction of the cars. They moved fast, fluid, like oil spilling over the ground. They were not vehicles. They were people. But they were not walking. They were running with a frantic, insect-like energy, swarming over the stalled cars, pulling things, pulling people out of the windows. I watched a man on the roof of an SUV swinging something, maybe a tire iron, at the crowd below him. He held them back for seconds. Then the tide rose over the hood, over the roof, and he vanished. I lowered the binoculars. The wind hit my face, freezing the sweat on my forehead. The helicopter pilot, a guy named Mac, who flew an old, battered Bell Jet Ranger, was supposed to pick me up on Thursday. Today was Tuesday. Mac was reliable. He flew bush in Alaska for 20 years. But looking at that highway, at the smoke choking the valley floor, I knew the math. Mac was not coming. The realization did not hit me with panic. It hit me with the dull, heavy thud of a breaker tripping. I was stranded at 7,000 feet. I had a truck parked at the trailhead, but the trailhead was 15 miles of logging road away, and the highway below was a kill zone.
I looked at the shelter. I looked at the propane tanks. I looked at the fence. I was not a soldier. I was not a survivalist who spent his weekends burying buckets of beans in the woods. I was a technician. I solved problems with schematics, leverage, and voltage. And right now, I was looking at the biggest engineering problem of my life. Problem 1. Exposure. The temperature tonight would drop to single digits. Problem 2. Resources. I had the lunch I packed and whatever was in the emergency kit. Problem 3. Defense. The fence was designed to keep out deer and hikers, not a swarm. I took a deep breath, the cold air stinging my lungs, and turned my back on the view. Staring at the end of the world would not fix it. I walked back to the shelter, stepped inside, and threw the heavy steel bolt on the door.
The sound of it locking into the frame, clack, thud, was the period at the end of my old life. I needed to inventory the asset. I started with the power. The site ran on a 48-volt DC plant, powered by a bank of commercial rectifiers. Since the grid was dead, the site was currently running on the backup generator, a 30 kW Kohler propane unit sitting on a concrete pad outside. I checked the fuel gauges on the propane farm. 2 1,000-gallon tanks. Tank 1, 82%. Tank 2, 15%. That was substantial. If I killed the non-essential loads, the high-power transmitters, the cooling fans for the empty racks, that generator could run for months. If I figured out how to cycle it, running it only to charge the battery banks and then shutting it down, I could stretch it through the winter. Heat was the byproduct. The generator produced waste heat and the equipment produced heat. The shelter was insulated to R20 standards. I was not going to freeze. Not yet. Water was the immediate crisis. There was no plumbing up here. We brought water up in jugs. I checked the supply cabinet in the corner. 3 cases of bottled water. 72 bottles. Roughly 9 gallons. A human needs a gallon a day to stay effective. Half a gallon to survive. 18 days. I circled the room, opening every cabinet, drawer, and service panel. I was looking for tools, raw materials, anything that could be repurposed. The tool crib. My personal bag, plus the site spares. Drills, impact drivers, crimpers, a soldering station, spools of copper wire, boxes of unistrut hardware, endless bolts and nuts. The kitchenette. A microwave, useless without AC power, which the generator provided, but it was a waste of fuel. A mini fridge, empty except for a jar of jalapenos and 2 packets of ketchup. And a coffee maker. The first aid kit. Standard OSHA-compliant box. Band-aids, burn cream, eye wash. Not a trauma kit. I sat down in the rolling office chair and spun it around to face the door. The shelter was small, maybe 12 by 20 feet. It was crowded with racks. The hum was deafening. I stood up and went to the breaker panel. I needed to silence the beast. I flipped the breakers for the main microwave transmitters. The fans on the big radios spooled down. The room got quieter. I flipped the breakers for the HVAC. The roar of the air conditioners died. I flipped the breakers for the satellite uplink. Silence rushed into the room, heavy and ringing. Now, I could hear the wind howling outside, rattling the intake vents. I could hear the hum of the transformer on the wall. I needed to secure the perimeter before dark. The chain-link fence was 6 feet high with 3 strands of barbed wire on top. It was standard galvanized mesh. A truck could drive through it. A determined mob could push it over. I went outside, grabbing the heavy bolt cutters and a spool of 12-gauge solid copper ground wire from the shelf. The wind almost knocked me over as I stepped off the concrete pad. The sun was dipping below the peaks to the west, casting long, purple shadows across the snow. The temperature was plummeting. I walked the fence line. The gate was the weak point. It was a double swing drive gate, held shut by a simple drop rod and a padlock. The drop rod went into a loose hole in the gravel. You could lift the gate off its hinges if you had 2 guys and a pry bar. I knelt in the gravel, my knees instantly numb through my work pants. I took the copper wire, thick, stiff stuff used for grounding lightning rods, and began to lace the 2 gate leaves together. I wove the wire through the mesh, twisting it tight with my lineman's pliers. I created a rigid stitch pattern, turning the 2 swinging gates into a solid wall. It was not enough. I looked at the heavy equipment sitting in the compound. There was an old, rusted propane tank the size of a coffin that had been decommissioned years ago and left to rot. It was empty, but it was heavy steel. I could not lift it, but I understood leverage. I went back to the shed and found a come-along, a hand-operated ratchet winch used for tensioning tower guy wires. It was rated for 2 tons. I wrapped a strap around the rusted tank and hooked the come-along to the base of the tower leg. I cranked the handle. Click, click, click. The steel cable tightened. The tank groaned, broke its frozen seal with the earth, and began to drag. It took me an hour. My hands were cramping around the handle, my breath burning in my throat. I dragged the tank 6 feet until it was wedged directly behind the gate. Now, even if the lock failed or the wire snapped, the gate could not swing inward more than an inch. It was backed by 500 pounds of dead iron. I did the same with a stack of galvanized unistrut channels, piling them against the hinge side. By the time I was done, the gate was not an entrance anymore. It was part of the fence. I stood back, panting, wiping my nose on my sleeve. The sun was gone. The sky was a deep, bruising blue, fading to black. The first stars were coming out, sharp and cold. Down in the valley, the world was burning. I could see the glow now, tiny orange embers flickering in the dark. Towns, gas stations, the highway. The fire was alive, but up here, the mountain was dead and still. I was shivering uncontrollably now. The sweat from the exertion had soaked my base layers, and the evaporation was sucking the heat out of my core. I needed to get inside. I walked back to the shelter, the gravel crunching loudly under my boots. I stepped inside and locked the steel door, throwing the deadbolt and the latch. The room was cooling down fast without the equipment running. It was already 50 degrees in there. I looked at the server racks. They were bolted to the floor and the ceiling. They were rigid, steel cages. I took my sleeping bag, a 0-degree mummy bag I kept in the truck for emergencies, and unrolled it on the anti-static mat between the racks. It was a hard floor, but it was dry. I sat on the bag, my back against the server cabinet, and pulled my notebook out of my pocket. I clicked my pen. My hand was shaking, making the letters jagged. Inventory, day 1. Water, 18 days. Food, 3 days. Fuel, indefinite, if rationed. Comms, dead. Status, alone. I stared at the word alone. I thought about my apartment in Seattle, my cat, a stray I'd started feeding, my collection of vintage radios, my sister in Portland. I forced myself to close the book. Dwelling on what was down there was a luxury I could not afford. The emotional energy would burn calories I needed to save. I turned off the overhead fluorescent lights.
The room plunged into darkness, lit only by the faint green LEDs of the battery charge controller and the red glow of the smoke detector. I lay down in the bag, zipping it up to my chin. The silence of the mountain was heavy, pressing against the steel walls. I could hear the wind buffeting the relay dish on the tower above, a low, rhythmic thrumming. Whoomp, whoomp, whoomp. It sounded like a heartbeat. I closed my eyes, but I did not sleep. I listened. I calibrated my ears to the new acoustic baseline of the shelter.
I needed to know what normal sounded like, so I would know the exact second something changed. The wind, the thermal contraction of the metal roof, the hum of the inverter. Somewhere in the distance, a sound cut through the wind, a faint, popping noise. Pop, pop, pop. Gunfire. It was miles away, carried on the updraft. It sounded small, insignificant, like popcorn. I pulled the sleeping bag tighter. I was the keeper of the lighthouse, but the ships were all sinking. All I could do was make sure the glass did not break. I was safe for tonight. The door was steel. The fence was wired. The cold was my moat. But the water calculation was ticking in the back of my head. 18 days. I needed a system. The roof. The snow. I fell asleep drafting a blueprint in my mind, visualizing pipe fittings and gravity feeds, turning the problem over and over until the math drowned out the memory of the bodies on the highway. The morning sun did not bring warmth. It just brought visibility. I woke up stiff. The floor was unforgiving, and the air in the shelter was hovering around 40 degrees. I could see my breath. I unzipped the bag and sat up. The first thing I did was check the battery voltage on the monitor. 54.2 volts. The batteries were full. The generator had kicked on sometime in the night, run its cycle, and shut off. The system worked. I ate a granola bar for breakfast, chewing slowly, making it last. Then I geared up. Carhartt jacket, beanie, gloves. I unlocked the door and pushed it open. The light was blinding. The sun reflecting off the snow and the white rye mice on the tower was painful. I squinted against the glare. The valley below was covered in a blanket of low-hanging smog, smoke trapped by an inversion layer. I could not see the highway anymore. I could not see the carnage. Just a gray, toxic sea. I walked to the edge of the compound to check my repairs on the gate. The come-along was holding tension. The wire stitching was intact. Then I looked at the snowdrift piling up against the north side of the shelter. It was clean. White powder, maybe 3 feet deep. Water. I went to the tool crib and found a roll of heavy-duty, distinct black coaxial cable. It was stiff, shielded cable, useless for plumbing. I tossed it aside. I needed a vessel. I found a 55-gallon plastic drum in the generator enclosure. It was used for waste oil. It was half full of black sludge. Useless, I muttered. Cleaning that out would take solvents I did not have and water I could not spare. I looked up at the tower. The waveguide bridge. It's a steel tray, like a ladder, that carries the cables from the tower into the shelter. It was covered in a galvanized steel shield to protect the cables from falling ice. It was essentially a gutter. If I could modify the shield. I climbed the short ladder to the shelter roof. The wind was lower today, manageable. The roof was a flat expanse of corrugated steel. The waveguide bridge came down from the tower and entered the building through a port in the wall. I pulled my tape measure. The shield was 12 inches wide. If I blocked the bottom end and heated the snow,
No, that was too complicated. I needed volume. I went back inside and looked at the server racks again. The doors on the racks were perforated steel mesh, useless for holding liquid. But the side panels... The side panels of the server cabinets were solid sheet metal, powder-coated steel, 4 feet tall, 3 feet deep. If I took a side panel off, laid it on its back, and bent the edges up, I'd have a shallow tray, a solar melter. I spent the next hour with the drill, removing the screws from the empty rack in the corner. The panel came free with a clang. It was heavy, decent gauge steel. I dragged it outside. I set it on top of the black plastic storage crate I used for spare parts, angling it toward the sun. I needed to seal the corners. I did not have a welder. I went to the supply cabinet and grabbed a tube of butyl rubber sealant, the sticky black goop we use to waterproof cable entry ports. It stays flexible in the cold. I used my lineman's pliers to bend the corners of the panel up, hammering them flat with a mallet to create a crude lip. It was not pretty. It looked like a warped baking sheet, but it held its shape.
I smeared the butyl rubber into the seams, working it in with my thumb until the gaps were black and solid. I scooped snow onto the tray using a dustpan, a mound of white powder. Now, physics. The sun was bright, but the air was freezing. The white snow reflects sunlight. It does not absorb heat efficiently. I needed a heat sink. I went to the trash bin. I found a black plastic garbage bag. I cut it open and laid it flat over the snow, pressing it down. The black plastic would absorb the solar radiation, heat up, and melt the snow underneath. The water would run down the slope of the tray and... I needed a catch basin. I emptied my tool bucket, a sturdy 5-gallon canvas and plastic bucket. I scrubbed it out with a dry rag. I set it under the corner of the tray. I sat there and watched it. 10 minutes. 20. Nothing. I checked the temperature on my watch. 28 degrees Fahrenheit. The sun hit the black plastic. Finally, a drop. A single, clear bead of water rolled out from under the plastic, trailed down the black steel, and fell into the bucket. Plink. Then another. Plink. It was agonizingly slow, but it was free. It did not cost fuel. It did not cost calories. I stood up, feeling a rare flash of satisfaction. It was a start. But as I turned to go back inside, a flash of motion caught my eye. Down the ridge, maybe 400 yards away, where the service road curved around a granite outcrop, a figure. My hand went to my belt, but I did not have a gun. I had a hammer. I dropped to a crouch behind the generator unit, peeking through the mesh of the fence. I raised the binoculars. It was a man. He was wearing a bright yellow parka, expensive, North Face. He was stumbling. He fell into the snow, got up, and fell again. He was not running like the things on the highway. He was plodding. He was carrying a ski pole in one hand. I focused on his face. He was pale, frostbite white patches on his cheeks. His mouth was open, gasping. He was not one of them. He was a survivor. And he was looking right at the tower. I lowered the binoculars. If he made it to the gate, I had a choice. The water dripped into the bucket behind me. Plink. 1 gallon a day. If I let him in, that became 2 gallons. If I let him in, my food supply was cut in half. I watched him struggle through a drift, sinking to his waist. He was weak. He might not even make the climb. I stayed crouched behind the generator,
the cold seeping into my legs, and waited to see if the mountain would make the decision for me. The man in the yellow parka died 20 feet from the gate. I did not watch him die. I did not have the stomach for it, and more importantly, I did not have the thermal budget to stand motionless in the wind, witnessing the inevitable. I had gone back inside, monitored the voltage regulators, and waited for the sun to drag itself across the sky.
When I came back out 2 hours later, he was a static object. A pile of bright synthetic fabric collapsed against a drift, half buried in the spin drift blowing off the peak. He was face down. The snow around his mouth was stained pink. Pulmonary edema, maybe, or just the capillaries in his lungs bursting from the altitude and the cold. I stood on the inside of the fence, looking through the chain link. My breath steamed in the air. The moral calculus of the situation sat heavy in my gut, a cold, indigestible stone. If I had opened the gate, I would be sharing my 18 days of water. We would both be dead in 9. By keeping it closed, I had bought myself a future. But the price was standing here, looking at a man who had frozen to death within screaming distance of a heater. I unlocked the padlock. The mechanism was stiff, the tumblers sluggish with cold grease. I had to heat the key with my breath to get it to turn. I squeezed through the gap, keeping the heavy steel gate backed by the propane tank so it could not swing wide. I moved quickly. This was not a burial. It was a salvage operation. I rolled him over. He was young, maybe mid-20s. Expensive haircut, or what was left of it. He wore a smartwatch that was dark and dead on his wrist. I started with the pack. It was a flimsy day hiker bag, lightweight nylon. Inside, a crushed bag of trail mix, a half-empty plastic water bottle that was frozen solid, a spare pair of socks, and a wallet. I ignored the wallet. I took the food and the socks. Then I looked at the parka. It was high-end gear, a North Face Summit Series, Gore-Tex shell, down baffle construction, far better than my canvas work jacket. Stripping a frozen body is a wrestling match with rigored limbs and stiff fabric. It is an intimate, gruesome labor. I had to articulate his arms, forcing the elbows to bend against the freeze, listening to the dry crack of tendons. I felt like a ghoul, a carrion bird picking at the dead, but I forced the feeling down. I visualized the R value of the down feathers. I visualized the windproof membrane. It was not a coat. It was a life support system component. I got the parka off. Underneath, he wore a fleece pullover. I took that too. I left him in his base layer and ski pants. I dragged the body away from the gate, pulling him by the ankles over the crusty snow until he was behind the line of scrub pines, out of direct sight of the shelter. I did not want to see him every time I checked the perimeter. I walked back inside, locked the gate, and threw the bolt. My hands were shaking, not just from the cold. I sat on the floor of the shelter for 10 minutes, staring at the yellow pile of stolen warmth, breathing hard. Then I stood up. I had calorie-dense nuts. I had an extra layer of insulation. But the bucket under the solar melt tray was the problem. I checked it. In 4 hours of direct sunlight, the black panel had yielded maybe 12 ounces of water. A cup and a half. It was a failure. The sublimation rate at this altitude, the wind stripping the moisture away before it could bead up, was fighting the melt rate. The physics did not work. I was losing water to the atmosphere almost as fast as I was melting it. I needed brute force. I needed kilowatts. I looked at the status panel on the wall. Generator status. Standby. Battery voltage.
51.2 volts, discharging. The Kohler 30 Res G generator outside was a beast, a 2.5-liter four-cylinder industrial engine. When it ran, it turned propane into 240-volt electricity, but that was only 30% of its energy output. The rest was waste heat. It dumped thousands of BTUs out of the radiator and the exhaust pipe every minute it ran. I was sitting in a freezing metal box while a machine outside was capable of boiling an ocean. If only I could capture the leak. I needed to build a heat exchanger. I grabbed my tool bag and the yellow parka, my new uniform, and headed out to the generator enclosure. The generator sat inside a weather-protective housing, a beige steel box about the size of a smart car, lined with acoustic foam. I unlatched the side panels and lifted them off. The engine block was cold, a mass of cast iron and aluminum. I studied the airflow. The engine had a pusher fan.
It pulled cold air in from the rear of the enclosure, pushed it over the engine block, through the radiator, and blasted it out the front grille. When this thing was running under load, the air coming out of that radiator was roughly 170 degrees Fahrenheit. It was a high-volume hairdryer. My plan formed in layers. Capture. Build a duct to catch the radiator blast. Process. Route that hot air into a melting chamber. Filtration. Catch the water. I needed sheet metal. I looked at the shelter roof. No, I could not compromise the weather seal. I looked at the server racks inside. I had already cannibalized one side panel. The tops and bottoms were solid too. I went back inside and spent 20 minutes dismantling the top plates of the empty equipment racks. They were square steel plates, 24 by 24 inches. I gathered 4 of them. Then I needed tools. I laid them out on the workbench. A pair of WIS aviation snips, straight cut. A cordless impact driver with a magnetic chuck. A handful of self-drilling tech screws, the kind with a little drill bit tip. A roll of aluminum foil tape. The tube of butyl sealant. The fabrication process was loud. I did not care. The wind was louder. I started by cutting the server rack panels. The steel was 16 gauge, thick enough to be structural, but thin enough to cut if you had strong forearms. I marked my lines with a Sharpie. I was building a hopper, a funnel shape that would hold snow. Snip, crunch. Snip. The metal curled away from the blades, razor-sharp ribbons falling to the floor. My grip strength started to fail after the third cut, the tendons in my forearm burning. I paused, shook my hand out, and kept cutting. I folded the panels into a pyramid shape, an inverted pyramid with the bottom point cut off. This was the melting cone. I drilled pilot holes along the seams and drove the tech screws in. Zip, thunk. Zip, thunk. The screws bit into the metal, pulling the seams tight. I sealed the inside of every joint with a thick bead of butyl rubber, smoothing it with a gloved finger. It had to be watertight. Next, the oven. I needed a box to enclose the hopper, something to trap the hot air. I went back to the generator. The enclosure itself had louvered vents on the front discharge. I removed the louvers. Now I had a rectangular hole where the hot air blasted out. I measured the opening. 20 inches wide, 16 high. I went back to the salvage pile. I did not have enough sheet metal left to build a full duct. I looked around the compound, desperate. My eyes landed on the HVAC system on the side of the shelter. The barred wall mount unit. It had an economizer hood, a big metal snout on the front of the unit designed to bring in fresh air. Since the AC was dead, the hood was useless. I climbed the ladder, bracing my boots against the vibrating siding. I used a nut driver to back out the sheet metal screws holding the hood to the chassis. There were 20 of them, rusted and stubborn. 2 snapped off. 1 stripped, and I had to cut the head off with a Dremel tool, sparks dancing in the gray light. When the last screw came free, the hood dropped. It was heavy, galvanized steel, about the size of a large suitcase. Perfect. I dragged it to the generator. The geometry was messy. The hood did not fit the generator discharge perfectly. I had to improvise an adapter. This is where the technician mindset takes over. You do not look for pretty. You look for functional. You look for the path of least resistance. I used the server rack scraps to bridge the gap. I screwed flanges onto the generator housing, drilling right into the factory paint. I mounted the HVAC hood so it faced upwards, like a chimney, catching the radiator exhaust. Inside this chimney, I suspended my melting cone. I drilled holes through the lip of the cone and ran lengths of threaded rod, scavenged from the cable tray supports, across the hood to hold it in place. So, the design was: the generator pushes hot air into the HVAC hood. The air rushes around the suspended steel cone, heating it from the outside. The snow inside the cone melts. The water drips out the bottom of the cone. But where does it go? I needed plumbing. I went to the cable entry port on the shelter wall.
We use boots, thick rubber grommets, to seal the cables.
I had spares. I found a length of 7/8" Heliax coaxial cable in the scrap pile. Heliax is the gold standard of RF transmission. It's a hollow copper tube, the center conductor, inside a corrugated copper tube, the outer conductor, separated by foam dielectric. If you strip it, it's just copper pipe. I clamped the cable in the vise. I used a utility knife to slice the black polyethylene jacket. I peeled it back like a banana skin. Underneath was the corrugated copper. I used a pipe cutter to snap it. Then, I used a pair of needle-nose pliers to grip the center conductor and the foam. I pulled. It fought me, the foam bonding to the copper walls. I had to heat the cable with a heat gun to soften the adhesive. Finally, with a wet, sucking sound, the core slid out. I had a 3-foot length of flexible, corrugated copper pipe. I attached one end to the bottom of my melting cone using a hose clamp and a copious amount of silicone. I bent the pipe so it exited the HVAC hood through a hole I punched in the side. I placed the 5-gallon bucket underneath the pipe exit. It looked like a monstrosity, a Frankenstein machine of beige generator parts, gray HVAC ducting, and black server panels, all screwed together with mismatched hardware and smeared with sealant. But it was solid. I checked the time. 3 p.m. The sun was fading. Time to test.
I grabbed the snow shovel and filled the cone. It held about 4 gallons of packed snow. I walked to the generator control panel. I flipped the switch from auto to run. The starter motor whined, ree, and then the engine caught with a guttural roar. Black smoke puffed from the exhaust stack, and the unit settled into a steady 1800 RPM hum. I felt the vibration through the soles of my boots. I moved to the front of the unit. The fan was pushing air. I could feel the pressure building inside my makeshift duct. I put my hand on the steel of the HVAC hood. Cold. Cold. Tepid. Warm. Within 5 minutes, the steel was hot to the touch. The radiator thermostat had opened, allowing the coolant to flow, and the heat exchange was live. I watched the copper pipe. A minute passed. The vibration of the generator shook the snow in the hopper, settling it. Then, a trickle. Not a drop. A steady, pencil-thin stream of water began to flow from the copper pipe. I let out a breath I did not know I was holding. Yes, I whispered. Yes. The water was cloudy, gray with dust and whatever particulate was in the snow. It was not drinkable yet.
but it was volume. I watched the bucket fill. In 20 minutes, I had 3 gallons of water. I did the math in my head. The generator burned 1.8 gallons of propane per hour at half load. In 1 hour, I could melt maybe 10 gallons of water. 1 hour of runtime equals 10 days of water.
The trade-off was spectacular. I was trading fuel for life at a rate that made sense. I switched the generator off. The silence rushed back in, leaving my ears ringing. I carried the bucket inside like it was full of nitroglycerin. I set it on the workbench. Now, filtration. I could not drink this. It probably had pine resin, atmospheric soot, and bird droppings in it. I needed a filter stack. I took a 2-liter plastic soda bottle from the trash. The previous tech had a Mountain Dew addiction. I cut the bottom off. I inverted it. Layer 1. Bottom. Cotton. I used a wad of sterile gauze from the first aid kit. Layer 2. Sand? I did not have sand. I had gravel outside, but it was frozen into the ground. Layer 3. Charcoal. This was the key. Activated charcoal absorbs toxins and chemicals. I did not have activated charcoal. But I had a notepad, and I had a metal trash can. I took the notepad, ripped out the pages, and crumpled them. I threw them in the trash can. I added some wood scraps, shims I found in the installation kit. I lit them on fire with a lighter. I let them burn down to red coals, then smothered the fire by putting the lid on the can. I waited for it to cool. While I waited, I looked for a mid-layer. Fiberglass. The shelter insulation. The walls were packed with pink fiberglass bat. I took my utility knife and sliced a small slit in the vinyl backing of the wall insulation near the floor. I pulled out a handful of pink fluff. It was nasty stuff. You do not want to breathe it. But as a mechanical filter for particulate, it was excellent. I packed the neck of the bottle with gauze, then a layer of pink fiberglass. I opened the trash can. The wood had turned into charred black lumps. I crushed them with the handle of my hammer until I had a coarse black powder. I poured the charcoal over the fiberglass. I placed the filter assembly over a clean cooking pot. I poured the gray snow water into the top. It took time. The water had to fight its way through the layers. But when it dripped out the bottom, into the pot, it was clear. I smelled it. It smelled faintly of smoke. I was not done. Biologicals. Bacteria do not care about charcoal. I put the pot on the floor. I did not have a stove, but I had the generator. I realized I had missed a step. I could have boiled the water while the generator was running if I had placed the pot directly in the airstream. No, that was not efficient. I looked at the kitchenette, the electric coffee maker. It was a standard drip machine. It had a heating element. I poured the filtered water into the reservoir. I plugged the machine into the UPS, uninterruptible power supply, that powered the servers. The UPS had battery reserves. I hit the switch. The machine gurgled. Steam rose. Hot water began to drip into the carafe. 190 degrees Fahrenheit. Not quite a rolling boil, but close enough to kill most things if run through twice. I sat there, watching the brown liquid, coffee residue from the old filter basket, fill the pot. I would have to clean that later. When it was done, I waited for it to cool. I took a sip. It tasted like burnt plastic and old coffee. It was the best thing I had ever tasted. Night fell hard. The wind picked up, shaking the shelter walls. I had 5 gallons of raw water in the bucket and half a gallon of potable water in bottles. I was hydrated. My headache was gone. I turned my attention to the radio.
The silence on the spectrum analyzer was still haunting me. I refused to believe the entire electromagnetic spectrum was dead. Physics does not stop working just because society does. I sat at the workbench, illuminated by the single task light I allowed myself. I had a Motorola APX portable radio, but that was just for local comms. I needed to reach out. I looked at the rack. We had a legacy HF high-frequency rig, an old Kenwood transceiver left over from the days before satellite backhaul. It was dusty, unconnected. I pulled it out of the rack. I hooked it up to the 12-volt DC bus. Antenna. I did not have a tuned HF antenna, but I had the tower. The entire 120-foot steel structure was a vertical radiator if I could load it properly. I ran a jumper cable from the radio's antenna port to the shelter's main ground bus.
I used the tower itself as the antenna element. It was a shunt feed arrangement, crude, terrible SWR, standing wave ratio, but it might receive. I put the headphones on. I started scanning the lower bands. 80 meters, 40 meters. Static, crackle, hiss. I spun the VFO knob, scrolling through the frequencies. 800 megahertz. Nothing. 200 megahertz. Nothing. I moved up to 14 megahertz, the 20-meter band. This band bounces off the ionosphere. It can carry signals around the world. Static. Static. And then, a voice. It was faint, buried in the noise floor, drifting in and out like a ghost. Repeat. Sector 4 is compromised. Naval assets moving to shoreline. I froze, pressing the headphones tighter to my ears. I fine-tuned the dial. Quarantine protocols are effect. Any vessels in the sound must. It was a loop, a recording. It sounded military. Sector 4. That was the Puget Sound region. My home. Compromised. I listened for 10 minutes until the signal faded into the atmospheric noise. It did not repeat. I leaned back in the chair, taking the headphones off. The Navy was moving. That meant there was still a Navy. That was good. Compromised meant they were retreating or shelling the shoreline. That was bad. I was not being rescued. The recording was a warning to stay away, not an invitation to come in. I stood up and walked to the door. I checked the lock. I had water. I had heat if I ran the generator. I had a fortress. But as I looked at the dark racks of silent equipment, I realized the shelter was not designed for a human. It was designed for machines. It was deafeningly loud when the generator ran, freezing when it did not, and the air was stale. I needed to modify the habitat. I looked at the acoustic foam lining the generator enclosure outside, and I looked at the sleeping bag on the hard floor. Project for tomorrow. Soundproofing and insulation. But first, sleep. I crawled into my bag, wearing the dead man's fleece. It was warm, comfortably warm. For the first time in 2 days, my feet were not ice blocks. I closed my eyes, and the image of the man's frozen face flashed in my mind. The pink snow. I had stripped a corpse. I had built a machine to drink snow. I was listening to the Navy abandon my home. Adapt, I whispered to the dark room. The wind howled outside, a high-pitched shriek through the tower lattice. It sounded like a scream. I rolled over, pulled the fleece hood over my ears, and forced myself to sleep. Tomorrow,
I had to figure out how to poop in a sealed room without turning it into a gas chamber. One problem at a time. The barometer on the wall was an analog dial, an old brass-cased instrument that looked like it belonged on a ship rather than inside a digital relay station. I had tapped the glass with my fingernail 3 hours ago.
The needle had jumped left, dropping past 980 millibars. Now, it was burying itself in the corner of the dial labeled Storm. The wind outside had changed. For the first few days, it had been a constant, bullying shove from the west. Now, it was pulsing. It would go dead silent for 3 seconds, a vacuum of pressure that made my ears pop, and then slam into the shelter with the force of a freight train derailment. The steel walls did not just vibrate, they flexed. I could hear the sheet metal skin popping in and out like a tin can being squeezed. I sat on the floor, my back against the server rack, dissecting the noise. I was not listening to the wind. I was listening to the tower above me. A guide tower is a living thing. It's held up by tension. The central mast rests on a pin at the base, and the heavy steel cables, the guys, pull it tight from 3 directions. When the wind hits it, the tower is supposed to move. It breathes. But there are frequencies you do not want to hear. Thrum, thrum, thrum. It was a low-frequency bass note, resonating through the concrete slab foundation and up into my spine. Aeolian vibration. That happens when the wind flows smoothly over the structural members, creating vortex shedding on the backside. It makes the steel sing. Usually it's harmless, but combined with ice, it's a death rattle. I stood up and walked to the door. I had to check the load. My hand touched the steel lever of the handle. It was freezing. Not cold. Freezing. A layer of frost had formed on the inside of the lock mechanism. I threw the bolt and pushed. The door did not move. Panic, sharp and electric, spiked in my chest. I shoved harder, putting my shoulder into it. The steel groaned, but the seam remained sealed. Ice. Freezing rain had been falling for hours, coating the entire mountaintop in a layer of clear, heavy glaze. It had sealed the doorframe shut. I was entombed. Think, I said aloud. My voice sounded small in the roaring room. I grabbed a flathead screwdriver and a rubber mallet from my tool bag. I worked the tip of the screwdriver into the weather-stripping gap. I hammered it in. Whack, whack. The rubber seal was frozen solid. I chipped away at the ice, bridging the door and the frame, moving inch by inch around the perimeter. When I finally kicked the door open, the seal shattered with a sound like a gunshot. The world outside was unrecognizable. It was not white. It was glass. Every surface, the gravel, the fence, the generator housing, the tower legs, was encased in 2 inches of clear ice. The floodlights on the shelter exterior were refracted through the glaze, casting weird, distorted rainbows across the compound. The rain was coming down sideways, stinging my face like buckshot, but I did not care about the rain. I looked up. The tower was a monster. The latticework, usually open and airy, was a solid wall of white. The ice had filled the gaps between the cross bracing. The structure had lost its aerodynamic transparency. Instead of the wind blowing through the tower, it was blowing against it. The wind load had just quadrupled. And it was twisting. I shone my high-lumen flashlight up the mast. The beam caught the glint of the guy wires. They were sagging. Heavy with ice, the cables were drooping, losing their tension. Because they were slack, the tower was not being held rigid. The top section, 100 feet up, was gyrating.
It was twisting clockwise, then snapping back counterclockwise, galloping. The torque arms, the heavy steel triangles that prevent the tower from twisting, were fighting a losing battle. If that oscillation hit the resonant frequency of the steel, the bolts would shear. The tower would buckle, and 120 feet of steel and ice would come crashing down, directly onto the shelter. I was standing in the drop zone. I looked at the guy wires closest to me, the A leg anchor. The turnbuckle was a massive chunk of galvanized steel, the size of my forearm. It was buried under a drift of ice. I did not have a choice. I could not stop the wind. I could not stop the ice. I had to restore the tension. If I did not tighten those cables, the mast would snap. I ran back inside. I did not panic. I went into procedure mode. Panic is a calorie waster. Panic kills you. Procedure saves you.
I stripped off the fleece and put on my climbing gear. Full body harness. Check. Positioning lanyard. Check. Safety climb cable grab. Check. Helmet. Check. I grabbed the biggest tools I had, a 24-inch adjustable wrench, the knuckle buster, and a 4-foot pry bar. I shoved a smaller screwdriver and a hammer into my bolt bag. I stepped back out into the maelstrom. The ground was a skating rink. I slipped immediately, my hips slamming into the concrete pad. I scrambled up, clawing at the generator housing for support. The wind was gusting to maybe 60 miles per hour. It tried to pick me up and throw me into the fence. I crab-walked to the A anchor point. This was the concrete block in the ground where the guy wires attached. The turnbuckles were encased in a block of ice the size of a mini-fridge. "Damn it!" I screamed, the wind tearing the word away. I fell to my knees and started hammering. I smashed the ice with the pry bar. Shards of glass like shrapnel flew into my face. I kept my head down, protecting my eyes, swinging blindly. Clang. Metal. I cleared the ice from the threads. The turnbuckle is a simple machine. You turn the body, and it pulls the two threaded rods together, tightening the wire. But these threads were frozen. I hooked the massive wrench onto the turnbuckle body. I braced my feet against the concrete block. I pulled. Nothing. It was seized. I pulled harder, screaming with the effort, my boots sliding on the ice. The wrench slipped, and my knuckles smashed into the galvanized steel. I felt the skin split, but the cold was so intense I did not feel the pain. It would not move. I needed leverage. I needed a cheater bar. I looked around. The unistrut channels I had used to barricade the gate. I scrambled over to the gate, slipping and sliding. I grabbed a 5-foot length of steel channel. I dragged it back to the anchor. I slid the channel over the handle of the wrench. Now I had a 6-foot lever arm. I leaned my entire body weight into it. Creak. The sound was agonizing, metal grinding against rust and ice. But it turned. A quarter turn. I reset my feet. I pulled again. Another quarter turn. I looked up at the wire. The slack was coming out. The heavy steel cable was lifting, vibrating as the tension returned. I did the same for the second wire on the anchor. Then I had to move to the B anchor. It was on the other side of the compound, facing the wind. Crossing the compound was a nightmare. The wind was channeling around the shelter, creating a Venturi effect that accelerated the air. I had to crawl on my hands and knees, dragging the tools. I reached the B anchor. I repeated the process. Smash the ice, clear the threads, apply the wrench, apply the cheater bar. My hands were losing dexterity. The gloves were soaked with freezing rain. My fingers felt like wooden dowels. I was fumbling with the wrench, dropping it, picking it up. I got the B anchor tight. I looked up. The tower was still moving, but the violent twisting had stopped. It was swaying now, a rhythmic, manageable sway. The tension was holding the structure plumb. I collapsed against the concrete block, gasping for air. The freezing rain was finding the gap in my collar, running down my neck. Then I heard the sound. Crack. It came from above, high above. I looked up, blinding myself with the flashlight beam against the falling ice. A chunk of rime ice, the size of a coffin, had broken loose from the microwave dish at the top. It was falling in slow motion, tumbling end over end. I did not have time to run. I just curled into a ball next to the concrete anchor block, covering my head with my arms. Boom! The impact shook the ground. The ice bomb hit the gravel 10 feet away from me. It exploded like a fragmentation grenade. Chunks of hard ice the size of softballs slammed into my helmet, my back, my legs. One chunk caught me on the thigh, right on the IT band. My leg went dead instantly. I lay there for a second, waiting for the follow-up. Ice usually sheds in clusters. Another crash, this one further away. Then silence, except for the wind. I tried to stand up. My left leg collapsed. "Get up," I hissed. "Get up or die." I forced myself up, putting all my weight on my right leg. I dragged the left one. It worked. Nothing was broken, just a massive contusion. A Charlie horse from hell. I limped toward the shelter. That's when I saw the generator. The ice bomb had not just missed me. The spray of shrapnel had hit the Frankenstein melt system I had built. The HVAC hood I had bolted to the exhaust was dented, crushed inward. The copper pipe was twisted. But worse, the intake vents on the back of the generator housing were blocked. The wind had plastered them with wet snow and ice, creating a solid wall. The engine was starving for air. I could hear the change in the RPMs. The engine was surging. Vroom, die. Vroom, die. If the generator died, I lost my heat. If I lost my heat, the batteries would freeze. If the batteries froze, I was dead. I could not fix the melt system now. I had to save the engine. I limped to the back of the housing. The intake louvers were clogged with a concrete-like mixture of sleet and ice. I used the flathead screwdriver. I stabbed at the mesh, punching holes in the ice. I scraped and clawed, clearing the airway. The engine smoothed out. The roar returned to a steady hum. I stumbled to the shelter door. I threw myself inside and slammed it shut, locking the bolt. The silence of the room was overwhelming. I stripped off the wet gear, leaving a puddle on the floor. My hands were white, waxy. I checked the monitor. Battery voltage, 53.0 volts. Tower stability, unknown. But the thrumming, the deep, resonant bass note, was gone. The guys were holding. I sank onto the sleeping bag, my body shaking violently, not just from cold. Adrenaline dump. I had won the round, but the tower had shown me something. It was not just a piece of metal. It was a sword of Damocles hanging over my head. Every ounce of ice that stuck to it brought me closer to being crushed. The storm lasted 3 days. For 3 days, I lived in a twilight state. I slept in 20-minute bursts, waking up every time the wind changed pitch. I ate cold beans from the can because I did not have the energy to heat water. The Frankenstein melt system was offline. The copper pipe had split in the cold. I was back to melting snow in the server panel tray inside the shelter,
using the ambient heat of the room. It was slow. I was dehydrated. My urine was dark amber. But the real crisis was not the storm. It was what the storm broke. On the fourth morning, the wind died. The sun came out, blinding and brilliant. I went outside to assess the damage. The compound was a disaster zone. Shattered ice lay everywhere. The fence was bowed inward where a drift had piled up. I walked to the generator. The exhaust hood, my water source, was wrecked. I would have to rebuild it. But then I looked at the propane tanks. The heavy ice had accumulated on the copper pigtail, the small, curved pipe that connects the large tank to the regulator.
The weight of the ice had pulled on the copper. I heard it before I saw it. Hiss. A faint, steady sibilance. I dropped to my knees in the snow. I brushed the snow away from the regulator assembly on Tank 1. The copper line had not snapped. It had cracked at the flare fitting. Propane was leaking. I watched the shimmer of gas escaping into the cold air. Tank 1 was my main supply. It had been at 80%. I looked at the gauge. Tank 1, 12%. I stared at the needle. My stomach dropped through the floor. It must have been leaking for days. The storm wind had masked the sound. The storm wind had carried the smell away. I had lost nearly 700 gallons of fuel. I reached out with a trembling hand and closed the valve on Tank 1. The hissing stopped. I checked Tank 2. Tank 2, 15%. I did the math instantly. It was the only math that mattered. The generator burned 8 gallons an hour. I had roughly 150 gallons left between the dregs of Tank 1 and the reserve in Tank 2. That was roughly 80 hours of runtime, 3 days of continuous power. If I cycled it, running it only 4 hours a day to charge the batteries, I could stretch it. Maybe 20 days. 20 days. Before the leak, I had enough fuel to last until spring. Now, I had enough to last until the end of the month. I stood up, feeling the weight of the mistake. I had not cleared the ice from the fuel lines. I had focused on the tower, on the gate, on the water. I had neglected the veins of the system. I walked back into the shelter. The industrial island had just shrunk. I was not the captain of a fortress anymore. I was a passenger on a sinking ship. I sat at the workbench and opened the notebook. Crisis report. Structure. Stable. Guys retensioned. Water. System failed. Repair required. Fuel. Catastrophic loss. Remaining runway. 3 weeks. I stared at the page. 3 weeks. Then I looked at the radio on the bench. The one I had scavenged the parts for but had not finished optimizing. The Navy signal. The retreat. If I could not survive here, I had to leave. But leaving meant walking down the mountain, onto that highway of death. Unless. I looked at the map on the wall, a topographical map of the Cascades. There was another site. Summit 5. A larger relay. A hub. It was 12 miles north, along the ridgeline. It had a larger fuel farm. Diesel, not propane. 5,000 gallons. But 12 miles in 6 feet of snow? I looked at the items in the corner of the room. The dead man's ski pole. I did not have snowshoes. I went to the server rack, the side panels. I picked up the tin snips. If I could build a water heater out of trash,
I could build snowshoes out of aluminum and copper wire. I was not done. The mistake with the fuel line was a failure of maintenance. I would not make that mistake again. I spent the rest of the day in a frenzy of fabrication.
I cut the server mesh doors into oval shapes. I used the coax cable core, the copper wire, to create bindings. I used the foam padding from the shipping crates to line the footbeds. They were heavy. They were ugly. They clanked when I walked. But when I tested them on the drift outside, I did not sink. I had a new mission. The shelter was not a home anymore. It was a base camp. I had to prepare for an expedition. But first, the sanitation issue. It had been festering. The bucket in the corner was full. The smell was fighting the cold. I could not just dump it outside near the door. Hygiene discipline is survival discipline. I took the bucket. I put on my new, clanking metal snowshoes. I walked 50 yards downwind to the edge of the cliff. I looked down. The cloud layer had lifted. I could see the highway clearly now. The black swarm was still there, but it had changed. They were not moving randomly anymore. They were clustered. They had formed a circle around the entrance to the tunnel. And in the center of the circle, something was burning. A large fire. The infected do not build fires. I pulled the binoculars up. The fire was not a campfire. It was a pile of tires. Thick, black smoke. And standing near the fire, illuminated by the flames, were figures holding rifles. They were not military. They were not wearing uniforms. They were wearing mismatched gear. Raiders, or just survivors who had lost their minds. They controlled the tunnel. They controlled the road. My escape route to the west was cut off. I lowered the binoculars. The wind bit at my exposed cheeks. I emptied the bucket over the cliff. The waste fell into the abyss, disappearing into the white void. I turned back to the shelter. West was death. East was the fire. North, along the razor-sharp ridge, was Summit 5. And here, in the shelter, the clock was ticking down on the propane gauge. I had to become a mountaineer. I went back inside and looked at the radio again. I needed to know if Summit 5 was still online. I turned on the HF rig. I tuned to the telemetry frequency, the data channel the sites used to talk to each other. It was a digital chirping sound. Chirp, chirp. Silence. Summit 5 was silent. That could mean the radio was broken, or it could mean the generator there had failed weeks ago. There was only one way to find out. I grabbed the soldering iron. I needed to build a directional antenna. If I was going to walk 12 miles into the void, I needed to be able to scan the destination before I got there. I began to strip the coaxial cable again. This time, not for plumbing, but for its intended purpose. I was going to turn this shelter into a listening post. I would map the electronic landscape before I stepped foot on the physical one. I sat there, soldering in the cold, the smell of rosin flux mixing with the stale air. My hands were scarred, burned, and calloused. I was not just a technician anymore. I was the last engineer on Earth. And I had a job to do. "Control," I whispered to the static. "This is Thorn. Work ticket is open. Proceeding to troubleshoot." Time is no longer measured in hours or minutes. The digital clock on the wall, flashing 12 elec since the power cycling began, is a liar. Time is now measured in PSI. Every morning, I walk out to the propane tank. I wipe the frost off the gauge face with my thumb. I tap the glass.
I read the pressure. That number dictates my existence. If the pressure drops, my life expectancy drops. It has been 18 days since the storm. 18 days since the leak. I have settled into a rhythm that is almost industrial in its monotony. Panic is a chemical reaction, and chemicals burn out. What is left is procedure. I am no longer a man trapped in a box. I am a component of the station's operating system. I maintain the heat. I maintain the water. I maintain the calorie count. The shelter smells of unwashed synthetic fabric, ozone, and pine resin. It is a smell I have come to associate with safety. My routine is absolute. 0600, approximate. Wake. Do not move. Listen. The wind has a different voice in the morning. It is thinner, sharper. If the guy wires are singing a high pitch, the temperature is below 0. If they are thrumming low, it is warmer.
I check the silence of the radio spectrum. I check the silence of the valley. 0700, hydration and fuel. I drink 1 pint of water. It tastes of charcoal and fiberglass, a gritty, flat taste that coats the tongue. I eat a single portion of the dead man's trail mix. I count the almonds. 7 almonds, 3 cashews, a handful of raisins. I chew each one until it is a paste. Digestion requires energy. I make it easy for my gut. 0800 1200, fabrication. This is the work block. The shelter has become a workshop. I have dismantled every non-essential piece of equipment. The floor is a graveyard of screws, brackets, and wire. My project for the last week has been the eyes. I needed to know if Summit 5 was alive before I walked into the death zone to find it. The handheld radio did not have the gain to punch through 12 miles of granite interference. I needed a Yagi-Uda antenna, a directional beam. I built the boom from a 4-foot section of PVC conduit I tore out of the wall. The elements, the metal rods that catch the signal, were harder to source. I needed stiff, straight wire. I found it in the drop ceiling grid. The main runner bars were aluminum. I cut them into specific lengths using the formula 300/frequency and megahertz. I was targeting 900 megahertz, the SCADA telemetry band. Reflector, 16.5 centimeters. Driven element, 15.8 centimeters. Directors, 14.5 centimeters. I measured them with the micrometer calipers. Precision matters. A millimeter off, and the standing wave ratio spikes, reflecting the energy back into the radio instead of sending it out. I mounted the elements through holes drilled in the PVC, securing them with epoxy. The feed point was a hairpin match I bent from a paperclip, soldered to the coax pigtail. It was delicate work. My hands, calloused and cracked from the cold, felt clumsy holding the soldering iron. The smoke from the rosin flux curled up into my eyes, stinging, but I did not blink. I watched the solder flow, silver and liquid, bonding the copper to the aluminum. 1200. The scan. I took the Yagi outside. I wore my snowshoes, the server rack monstrosities. They clattered on the ice, but the copper wire bindings held my boots firm. I walked to the north edge of the compound, facing the ridgeline that disappeared into the white mist. I held the antenna horizontally, pointing it like a rifle toward where Summit 5 should be. I keyed the radio, sending a ping packet. Then I released and listened. Static. Static. I adjusted the azimuth 2 degrees east. Ping. Chirp. It was faint. A digital handshake. A heartbeat. Summit 5 was there. The repeater controller was powered. That meant its generator was running, or its batteries were holding.
It was a lighthouse blinking in the fog, telling me there was a harbor. 1300 to 1600. Physical condition.
You cannot walk 12 miles in deep snow with a 50-pound pack on a 2,000-calorie deficit without preparation. The mountain will eat you. I used the tower. Every afternoon, I clipped into the safety cable. I climbed to the 50-foot level. I stopped. I down-climbed. I repeated this 10 times. It was brutal. The rungs were ice-slicked. The wind tried to peel me off. My quads burned, and my lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass. But I forced the rhythm. Step, lock, step, lock. I was hardening. My body was consuming itself. I could see the definition of my ribs in the mirror, the hollowing of my cheeks. But the muscle that remained was dense and efficient. I was becoming like the tower, stripped of excess, held together by tension. 1700. The evening meal. I heated water on the generator manifold during its charge cycle. I poured it into a pouch of freeze-dried Mountain House stew I had saved from the site's emergency kit. I let it sit for 20 minutes, wrapping it in the fleece to keep the heat in. I ate slowly, staring at the map. The route was a jagged line, the Razorback. It was a narrow spine of rock connecting the two peaks. In summer, it was a Class 3 scramble. In winter, with ice cornices hanging over a 1,000-foot drop, it was a technical traverse. I was not a mountaineer. I was a technician. But I understood friction, gravity, and load. I treated the mountain like a structural problem. The ice was just a material with a specific shear strength. The wind was just a lateral load. The sled. I could not carry the batteries. I needed to bring power with me, spare lithium cells, the radio, the tools. My pack was too small. I built a pulk. I used the cover of the cable ladder tray. It was a 6-foot length of fiberglass, smooth on the bottom, with raised edges. It was designed to shed ice. It would slide beautifully. I drilled holes in the front lip. I rigged a harness using 2 lengths of 1-inch webbing and carabiners. I used PVC pipe sections as rigid traces so the sled would not run over my heels when I went downhill. I loaded it with weight, the dead man's frozen boots, spare heavy tools, and dragged it around the compound. It hissed over the snow. It tracked true. Day 21. The fuel gauge read 4%. The pressure was dropping. The flame in the generator was sputtering, running lean. It was time. I spent the final day mothballing Summit 4. This was not abandonment. It was a shutdown procedure. If I survived, if the world came back, this site would be needed. I coated the battery terminals in dielectric grease to prevent corrosion. I shut down the main breakers. I closed the intake louvers I had fought so hard to keep open, sealing the generator against the snow. I drained the water block I had built. I took the site logbook. I opened it to the last page. Technician E. Thorm. Date: unknown, approximately December 20th. Status: site offline. Fuel depleted. Action: moving to Summit 5 via Northridge. Note: the gate is barricaded. The system is intact. If you find this, check the A leg anchor tension before re-energizing. I left the book on the console. I left the keys hanging on the hook. I packed the sled, the spectrum analyzer, my eyes, the cordless impact driver and 2 spare batteries, my hands, the bolt cutters, the last 3 bottles of water, the remaining bag of trail mix, the dead man's socks, dry,
a coil of 100-foot rope. I put on the yellow parka. It was stained with grease and soot now, the bright Summit Series logo obscured by the grime of survival. I strapped on the server rack snowshoes. I stepped into the harness of the sled. I stood at the door of the shelter one last time. It was silent. The hum was gone. The heat was fading. It was just a cold metal box again. But it had kept me alive. It had been a shell, and I had been the hermit crab, growing until the shell was too small. I stepped out. The sun was rising, a pale, watery disk behind the overcast. The air was dead calm. The silence of the peaks was absolute. No cars, no planes, no sirens. Just the vast, indifferent white. I locked the door from the outside. Click, thunk. I dragged the sled to the gate. I undid the wire stitching I had spent hours weaving. I cranked the come-along to move the propane tank barricade.
It groaned, it sliding reluctantly on the gravel. I squeezed through the gap. I looked down at the valley one last time. The smoke from the tunnel entrance was still rising, a smudge of violence against the gray world. The raiders were still there, kings of the ashes. I turned my back on them. I looked north. The ridge stretched out before me, a terrifyingly narrow white highway suspended in the sky. The wind had sculpted the snow into knife edges and towers. It looked impassable. But somewhere, 12 miles away, a machine was humming. A green LED was blinking on a board. A system was waiting for an operator. I checked the load in the sled. I checked the bindings on my feet. "Work ticket open," I whispered. I took the first step onto the powder. The snowshoes sank 6 inches, then held. The sled hissed behind me. I fell into the rhythm. Step, breathe. Step, breathe. I did not look back at the shelter. I did not look down at the drop. I watched the snow 3 feet in front of my boots. The cold was biting, but the heat of exertion was already building under the parka. I was an engine now. I was a machine built of meat and determination, moving from one node to the next. The world had ended, but the job was not done. I walked into the white.